Welcome, everyone, to our fourth EEIR session. We're excited that Sharon Gillenwater and Shama Pagarkar are here to talk about the leadership journey as an entrepreneur who has exited, and some of the aspects today that we'll kick off our discussion on are how the leadership journey of an entrepreneur requires a lot of self-awareness. You develop a lot of humility, and there's a lot of learnings around tenacity and both when to tap into that tenacity and when to even step back and let some of that go.
I'm Sharon Gillenwater, and I started a company called Boardroom Insiders in 2008 at the ripe old age of 43 at the time. And I sold it in 2022 for 25 million. And we didn't raise venture capital, just a little bit of angel money. So we bootstrapped.
I'm Shama. I was the co-founder and COO of Joyrun, which was a peer-to-peer community-driven delivery platform. And we started the company in the end of 2014, and we sold it to Walmart December of 2020. And we were in 50 markets, 40 of them were college campuses.
We were just talking before this started about your leadership journeys. Would one of you want to start off with some of your key learnings as an entrepreneur about leadership? And maybe one of the things that we'll also talk about is how you're managing blind spots as an entrepreneur when there's so many different decisions to be made and so many different, say, options or opportunities, white spaces sometimes that you're facing.
Well, in my particular case, since we were bootstrapping, it was just me for a couple of years, and I took on a partner. And then we ran the business for almost 6 years without any full-time employees. We were just working with contractors. So if you think about, you're in this mode for quite a long time. And then in 2016, we started hiring, and then we hired, continually throughout the rest of the life of the business up to like 28 full-time employees. And that's a very different thing. I remember him saying to me at one point, like, we're in the people business now. And it took me a while to really understand what he was talking about, because you really have to shift to working on your team and supporting and managing your team as opposed to supporting and managing the business. And if you're doing your job correctly, you're pushing more responsibility and authority to your team. And so at some point, they know more about their part of the business than you do. And you have to empower them to run it and make decisions. And so that's hard to do when you've been running the show and having your hands in everything for so long. So that was a little bit of a challenge for me in the beginning. And there were a few times when I meddled in things that I shouldn't have. And people got upset about that. And I just had to own it. And if you own it and apologize and acknowledge that they are correct, that your team will give you a lot of leeway, and they'll forgive you for it and respect you for it. I hear stories of founders who don't do that, and they're continually messing people up in what they're trying to do and interfering in their jobs. And those are the founders that get a reputation, and there are quite a lot that do, and often even get pushed out. So that's something to be aware of as you build your team. And yes, it is humbling when you realize, like, oh, this is all my fault, and I need to apologize. And another thing that I did, even when we did have a couple of full-time employees early on, is I didn't act like a manager. I acted like a peer. So, because we didn't have enough people where I could push down responsibility yet. So they were pretty much doing the same stuff that I was doing in a lot of ways. And so we were peers in the trenches. And so I would commiserate with them and complain about things. And then that gave everyone else permission to complain and commiserate. And there was a point where I just brought a couple of, our first employees into a room, and I said, look, I did this, and it was the wrong thing to do. And I'm going to stop doing this. And I need you to stop doing it, because guess what? We're bringing in 2 people just out of college next week. And if they see you panicking and complaining, they're going to think that's okay. It's going to become part of our culture. So this has to stop today. I even pounded the table. But, the more you can own your part in whatever the dysfunctional pattern is, the easier that employees can accept it and, respect you for changing course.
I think these are such great gems, especially for early stage founders and leaders. And there's a couple of things that I just wanted to ask you about before we go on to Shama. So one is when you talked about managing the business and then transitioning to managing the team, I've also seen there are founding teams that, I'll just say, of a certain type that raise a lot of money, and they start out just with the goal of managing the team and fundraising. And so they don't actually, they're not building the business. So I found that, I think that's pretty problematic. I would consider that more problematic from my perspective than somebody who's, building the business and then has to make that transition. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that. And then also, I think it's also interesting how you talked about being in the trenches and having to make this shift, because being in the trenches is important in that, I think there can be that camaraderie, but it can be, to your point, problematic. And so one of those things, there's a term that's become popular, radical candor. And I just saw a post recently, they're calling it compassionate candor, which I think is great, but it's also really hard for people to adopt. And so I think what you're actually talking about is like, you were being candid, but have you gotten your team to be candid to bring these issues up? So those are my 2 questions.
Well, I think because we were working as peers, they felt very comfortable bringing it up. But I think it doesn't mean it was easy for them. And it was really only after some probing that I understood what they were trying to get at. Because at the end of the day, you're still their boss. And so there's going to be some fear there in bringing it up. So it's up to you to create an atmosphere where they can bring things up. And once you, and it's scary, I admit, but once you create that, once you make that happen once, it kind of gets addictive because you love it and you see the results. Like, this is great. And you see that people didn't freak out or have a bad reaction. And then it can become part of your culture. You can do it in a kind way. I remember I had to give a review once, and it was one of my first negative reviews I'd given everybody. And I just was really honest. I said, you worked really hard to get this job and you were such an amazing candidate. But then once you got the job, it just seemed like maybe you didn't like the job or want to keep the job. And I'll tell you right now that if you keep doing things the same way you're doing them now, you will not have this job by the end of the year. That's how honest I was. And you can do it in a kind way by saying something, nice, the compliment sandwich that we know about. I went on to say, you can do this job. You're good at all of these things, but you have to make the choice to do it. Otherwise, it's going to work out. So once you begin to approach people in that very honest way, you see the results were always positive, and I got kind of addicted to it. And the fear goes away and the discomfort goes away. You kind of have to let yourself sit in that discomfort and hopefully have a few wins where the results were very positive, and then it becomes easier and easier. I always marveled I had a manager once who was the only guy in the company who could fire people. And when it was time to get fired, he was going to do it. And he was good at it. Like, he did it in a way that actually didn't destroy people. It made them feel like, look, this just isn't a good fit. And I need to go and find what is a good fit for me. This is, the right thing to do.
Sharon brought up some very important points. And Now, I just kind of want to say this right off the bat. There's a difference between leadership and management. And I think leadership is what comes handy in a startup. And the biggest difference is you lead by influence, but you're not your quintessential corporate world where people are reporting into you and then you're kind of giving them tasks and then monitoring those tasks. You don't have that luxury in a startup, right? You have to lead and lead by being in the trenches with them or by setting the strategy for the business and while running the business, right? And what you do kind of amplifies and sets the culture very early on for the company. And you have to be very, very deliberate about that, to Sharon's point, right? And so I think, I kind of concur, but there is a big difference between leadership and management, right? And so I think like you have to over-index on the leadership and less on the management part. And, kind of give people autonomy to run their pieces, right? So that's that. I think that's number one. The second thing that, that we keep hearing this, and I think maybe it's said in a different context, but the way I read this in the corporate world is always about, oh, you need to manage up, right? Your career will progress when you manage up. Well, I think that, pardon my French, is complete BS in a startup world because as a leader, I don't want to be managed up. I want to hear the truth of what's going on so that I can take the right actions. I just don't have the cushion of being managed up or my ego being massaged or my emotions being managed, right? I want to know what's happening. And I think that should be in the DNA of a startup founder or of an entrepreneur. I'm just trying to kind of parse, what are the things that are, not applicable in the startup world at all. And so those are the most important tenets to run a company. Unlike Sharon, we had a team like right on the onset, right? But that didn't mean that I would just delegate and just walk away. And to your point, I still had to be in the trenches. I still had to kind of do the mundane things that needed to be done and fill the gaps wherever there were gaps. And, I think that's also a part of being a leader, right? Like fill the gaps where your team can't, on the things their team is too busy, either it's too busy or they can't do because they don't have the expertise, right? Then you have to kind of fill in the gaps, right? You have to be that generalist. So I think those are my points on leadership within a startup, kind of very different from a corporate environment.
I think this is such a great point, Shama. So actually, I just want to ask you two questions about this, just because we probably have people who've joined us from very different backgrounds. And then when we share this recording, also very different kind of understanding. So how would you describe the difference between management and leadership? And then also, this point you brought up about the difference between startup leadership and corporate leadership and these characteristics, which I think we can have a whole session, whether it's innate or you learn. I think, it's probably a spectrum. So there is this level of raw honesty or directness, in a sense, that's more essential in startups. It is essential in startups, especially early stage. That's not essential and maybe in some corporate environments considered problematic.
These principles are absolutely a must in startups, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist in the corporate world, right? Like a lot of the toxicity that we see in the corporate world is because these things don't exist there. So I'll come to that in a bit. But about leadership and management, I think anybody can be a leader in the sense you do not need to manage a group of 50 people or be in the empire building. You can actually be an IC, individual contributor, but still be the leader where everybody looks at. Leadership is about influence. It's not about managing people, right? And that's where the titles don't matter. And it's really the power of influence, like how much credit you have, how much strategy you have, how much empathy you have. And I think that's what kind of make a good leader, right? Versus a manager who's just kind of, monitoring how you're doing or kind of giving you these reviews, right? And I think that's another place where the leadership comes. I think leaders are more proactive in giving feedback so that they can preemptively fix things that are going wrong. And I think that's where the difference lies between leadership and management. There is this innate culture, and I think it's how we are trained. It's not necessarily how we need to be, right? I think what happens is I think spoiled men who obviously created the corporate world, right? We weren't around. And I think what happened there is that their egos had to be massaged. They wanted to empire build. They're not necessarily looking out for the good of the company. Their goals are aligned, they're mercenaries. Their goals are aligned to their own goals, right? And that may not be aligned to the goal of the company, right? Like when you say, oh, this person worked for me. No, actually that person worked for the company. You just happen to be their manager, right? Even if it works in the corporate world now, just because we've just been trained by it and everybody talks about, managing up, and that's the mantra that's going around in the corporate world, that does not fly at all in a startup. You really cannot do that, right? And that's where I was going. You just have to be honest. You have to be candid, and you have to empower your people and not just sit on your high horse that your ego needs to be massaged every single time.
My take is that when influence becomes the sole skill and it's not about values or competencies, then you have a highly political culture, and that ends up happening more in a corporate environment. Curious what your take is, Sharon, on that, and also that the question about leadership versus management.
I haven't worked directly in a corporate environment, although I've worked as a consultant to many huge corporations. And what I've observed and also experienced is, the number of people in my company grew, is managers typically are managing a lot of people, probably too many, because I think a manager can also be a leader. But to do that, they really have to have a lot of the soft skills, like knowing their people and what's motivating them as individuals. And that's something I think we did really well, because not everyone that you're managing is going to be motivated by the same thing. Even some salespeople are not as motivated by money as you would think. You might have a salesperson who is just highly motivated by praise and recognition, what really makes them tick. Yes, they like the money too, but most salespeople, it's just all about the money. So if you know that about your people, because you've taken the time to really talk to them and understand what makes them tick, you can be a much better manager and get into that, that leadership category where you actually can inspire your people, knowing what they really care about. As our company was growing, and if we had not exited, I had a plan to start breaking our largest team into smaller mini teams. Yes, that creates another layer, but what I was concerned about is we were losing the ability to really have close relationships between a manager and the people they were directly managing, because you want to create a positive culture where people are engaged and feel valued. And in order to do that, you have to really know them and model that from the top on down.
Sounds like you're saying that developing that awareness is more of a managerial process or skill, and then really knowing that about a team sort of stepping into leadership. I think one of the descriptions that I really liked about the difference between leadership and management is that management is meant to keep things the same. You're basically running the same loop over and over again. It's like, here's our operations and we're doing this thing and this is how we do it. And it's like, basically the goal is to not rock the boat. Stay steady. And leadership is about disruption and change and driving forward to a new vision. And so, like, inevitably, with leadership, you're going to have, I think, more dissatisfied people, especially early on with let's say it's a new initiative.
There's a lot of ambiguity when you're building something new. But then again, that's where like the good leadership comes in, right? Like, how do you, like to Sharon's point, how do you motivate people and also use their skill sets in the right way? I'm of the opinion that you always need to make good excellent. You can't just make bad okay, because there's no ROI in that. And so you have to understand their motivations and their skill sets, and then use your leadership to hone that so that then they align to what you are trying to do. I think that's very important. And I think Sharon hit on some of those points as well. Leadership is difficult because you may or may not have the title. You may not have necessarily the hierarchical or reporting structure, even in the corporate world. And I'm not saying that you don't have managers. That's not what I'm saying. But I think you need to have, I think leaders can be managers, but not all managers can be leaders. And making sure that you're promoting the right people, right? We're just not kind of checking if somebody's clocking in and clocking out. You don't want that kind of people in those leadership positions, right? And so basically cultivating the right culture so that you produce leaders who then manage the team is the way to go, in my opinion.